The wind came like a hand, pushing and cold, carrying the grit of the railroad yard and the wet breath of the river. Snow fell in fat, stubborn flakes that plastered to coats and to eyelashes, leaving a fine dusting on collars and on the grain of the wooden planks. The square was a white holler, lantern light doing its best to hold back the dark. Men stamped their boots until the sound stung their bones. Women drew shawls tight, the wool rough at their throats. Children were folded into arms like small birds, cheeks pink and fingers stuffed into mittened fists. Clara Hart stood on the wooden block with her hands folded over a tin needle box, its lid dented where her brother had once dropped a hammer. Her hem was clean but thin, the coarse wool of her skirt clinging at the edges where the snow melted and iced. The seamstress's fingers were red but steady. She had been sewing through the worst of the storm because work was all she owned. Above her left breast, she wore a little crescent of a scar, pale as an old stitch where a needle slipped years ago and had saved a life instead of taking one. It showed when she turned to look at the crowd, and the lantern light caught it like a small, stubborn moon. $10, the auctioneer called, his breath fogging like the rest of them. Someone laughed. The laugh was thin as a broken bell and carried like a stone skipping over ice. Clara felt the town's eyes on her the way she used to feel the draft under her shutters. Always there, always a chill. Her mind skittered through the people she had stitched for. A bride whose hands trembled as much as Clara's own. A widow's quiet black hem that had taken 3 days to press. The 3 shirts she patched for a man leaving for the mines, smelling of coal and tobacco. She looked past the crowd at the small girl behind her, Elsie, her niece, who pressed a mittened hand to her mouth and watched with eyes too old for 8 years. How did you explain to a child that adults could sell you if they liked the price? The question sat in Clara like a splinter. Please, Clara said, though please in a square full of men were like tossing thread into a gale. Please don't, for debt, the auctioneer said. Town debts are to be paid with coin or consequence. Who bids? A figure at the edge of the crowd, tall, wrapped in a great dark coat, flecked with snow, did not raise his hand. He watched like someone watching the tide, hands deep in pockets that had seen other winters. He was something the town remembered on paper and in low talk. Ben Mallory, the outlaw whose face had been sketched on handbills and nailed to the saloon doors. The sketch had a hardness to it. The man in the square had more stillness, as if the sketch had caught an instant of a man holding his breath against the cold. What will become of Elsie? A woman muttered at the back. Children don't belong in this sort of sale. The law doesn't ask who belongs, the mayor answered. It asks who pays. Clara wrapped her hands tighter around the needle box. Its metal bit was cold through her gloves, a little like the way a thought can be cold and undeniable. She tried to make her voice even, because even was safer than trembling and better for negotiations. I've worked for half this town, she said. I've mended coats, delivered tea, kept my shop open in the worst months. I can pay, if you'd let me work, if you'd take spindle or board. Don't make her pay. Not all debts are paid in work, Miss Hart, the auctioneer said, voice practiced and flat. This is town order. The hammer came down slow as a clock's hand. And then, 1-2 shots behind the lanterns, a sound like a warning bell that set a new rhythm in the square. Ben had not meant for it to come to that. He had not thought himself the sort to step into the light, but the sound of a woman being sold like a bale of winter hay, like she could be bundled and taken down a road and left in some barn, cut through whatever quiet he had been trying to wear. He stepped forward. The snow made his boots sound too loud on the wooden planks, the leather creaking like something waking. You can't sell her, Mayor, he said. His voice was low and rough from nights without enough sleep, but the square turned because it had to. Faces found his face. Fingers reached instinctively toward holsters and collars. Hands curled into the frayed wool of workmen's coats. You, Mallory, the sheriff said, recognizing what the rest of the town already had in the back of their minds. The old trouble. Hands where I can see 'em. Ben's hands lifted, not because the sheriff's orders meant law again, but because he saw Elsie's mittened fingers white around Clara's sleeve, the child gripping as if the seam that held her aunt together might snap. He thought of what he owed Clara. Warm bread left on his window once when he'd been too weak to move. The bucket of water she carried up to the lean-to the year he'd been broken. The simple seam to stitch his coat so he would not freeze. Those small mercies had once kept him whole enough to keep moving. He could not walk away now and let men take her. Please, Clara said, looking from the sheriff to the man who had stepped into her life like a storm. Her breath came in thin clouds. Please don't make this worse for her. The sheriff's jaw tightened. The auctioneer's hand hovered near the hammer. Someone in the back hissed. Ben Mallory looked at Clara, and something in him, old and stubborn, unclenched. He had been a shadow that hid in attics and in the folds of other people's lives. He had not imagined he would announce himself to a frozen square by defending a seamstress he had not known he loved yet, but he did not think, he acted. Take me instead, he said. For a long second, the square was full of wind and the quiet that comes when all the guns in a town are thinking hard. Would they take a man with a dozen blood debts? Would they take a man with a poster and a picture your pa kept in his pocket? Would they take a man who had been both terror and mercy in equal measure? You want to buy a man, the auctioneer said, a sneer like a blade, his breath a little sour in the cold. Ben's voice, when he answered, was not the singing violence the posters had promised. It was something softer and more dangerous, the kind of certainty that comes from having nothing left to lose. You sell her. I die trying to get her back. A laugh, then a shout. The hammer raised. It might have fallen, but before the wood met wood, someone in the crowd pushed. A man with a barroom debt to settle, a woman with a soft look in her eye. The sheriff, thinking of trouble and his own thin authority, barked for them to stand down. Ben stepped back into shadow. Clara's chest kept beating like a trapped bird, her hands still clenched around the cold tin. How far would the town go, she wondered, to take the small things and call them business? She did not know yet that the answer would be nearly everything. She did not know that the outlaw she had once hidden in an attic would become the reason the town's filthy secret perfumed the air, and that he would not only risk his life for her, but would, in the doing, expose how many women were being bought and sold like bolts of cloth. What had sent her to the block was a paper thin as a winter leaf, a notice from the bank. Pay by the end of the month, it said. Pay or forfeit. Her brother had gambled and left his tally unpaid. Her ledger, those neat lines of thread and penny, was not enough. The banker's ink was heavier than her stitches. She had come to town to beg, to bargain, to cede. She had not expected to be folded and sold. In the narrow hours after the auction, when the town's lanterns had dwindled to a few guttering souls, Clara walked the streets with Elsie at her heel. The wind ate their words, turning them to steam that disappeared before they could mean much. The seamstress's breath made clouds that softened and fell away. You could hide, Elsie said, indignation already a spark in her small face. Burrow, like you told me animals do. Clara smiled, though it was thin as a patch. I don't burrow, Elsie. I mend. I could sell my doll, Elsie said. She's only missing one eye. You wouldn't sell a thing you loved, Clara said. She meant it, but love in the ledger had been worth $9 and some grease money. The thought of it made her stomach clench. We'll think. They returned to Clara's shop, a small place smelling of linen and tallow and the faint perfume of lavender she used on winter hems, a strip of scent that clung to the air like a promise. It had been her shop for 7 years, a counter scarred by irons, a great flat of wood for laying cloth, a window that looked out on the river and the slow turning of the world. A pinboard held sketches of frocks and a scrap of handwriting in a young man's rough print, a soldier's letter she had once hemmed and put away for a woman who caught his eye on a train. There was a small brass locket on the counter that kept the picture of a man she had loved once, the one who died on the road, called away by fever and mud. She patted it with a thumb until the metal warmed beneath her skin. You remember the lullaby? Elsie asked that night before sleep, the words wrapped in wool and worry. Sometimes, Clara said. She thought of the lullaby in thin threads. When she hummed it, it stitched the past and the future in one line. If I hum, will you hush the worry for a while? Elsie nodded. Will you keep me, even if they come back? For as long as breath will bind us together, Clara promised. And the words were like folding a hem, simple, necessary, binding. Always. She had promises. She had stitches to make and groceries to buy and a child to keep. She had a secret, too, which she had kept beneath the floorboards for a month and which thundered in her chest now with the sound of wrongness being done. In a space behind the loft and under loose planks, she had been hiding him. Ben had come to her first wet and wild autumn, when bandages and cold made him smell of iron and riverweed. He had come with eyes like river stones, hard with current, and a wound that smelled faintly of old blood and the river's damp. Something in Clara's kindness had demanded shelter. Something in Ben had accepted it, and given in return a protection she had not expected. He patched the shingles when the rain came through, he split kindling, he kept the rats from having meetings in the rafters. He had been careful to keep his name off the door, careful to cloak the metal band of a wanted poster that had faded on the road. He had been careful because he had spent his life trading in mercies no man expected. Clara had hidden him the way a seamstress hides a hole in a hem, with careful stitches, with prayer, with a steady hand. She's kept me, Ben told himself the first night he slept in her spare room, where the pillow smelled faintly of starch and the dawn light came through thin curtains like an inquiry. She kept me when I had nothing but the bullet and the cold and my shame. He had not told Clara everything. Who tells everything when to say it aloud is to risk being called what you were? He had been a thing the law made ugly. He had run with men who counted coin by blood-silenced hours. Once, there had been a daughter between him and the world. She had been taken by fever the winter he was 20. and after that, his heart had been a cavity for a while. People named him an outlaw because a man is easier to sell as a monster than as a man who wept. He had been trying to quit. It is a slow thing to put away the cloak of your worst self. You fold it in carefully, as if it could wake. "I've been alone so long I forgot what hope feels like," Clara said to him once in the morning light, her voice almost a stitch. She had not meant it as a label. She had meant it as a fact. Ben did not answer with a speech. He pressed a cup to his lips and let the heat fill him. The tea tasted of lemon and the small, comforting bitterness of life. Later that day, when the town's debt notice had been pinned and the auction advertised in crude script on the post, he thought of the way the town had come to her like dogs to a bone. He went down to the tracks to see the trains pass and did not let himself be seen. He wrote a list in his head: bread, coal, a fair bit of coin to settle small things. He thought about leaving entirely, taking his old nickname and running east where he was less known. But the ledger, Clara's ledger, sat on the counter where he could see it through the thin slats of her shutter. The bank had ragged teeth and sought to bite. She could not pay. They would take her as a thing and give her to the highest bidder. Ben's fist closed in on that image until his knuckles went white. "You could go," Clara said one night. She had seen the wanted posters downtown and had asked nothing, as if she had no right. "You could draw away from this winter and let me soften the edges before the town can make them sharp." "Not everyone gets to walk away without trading something," Ben answered. There was a hollow in him that could not be paid with coin. He watched the steam curl from his cup, thinking of what it would mean to leave. "If I leave, they'll come for you anyway, Clara, and I won't be able to wait a whole life to know what happens to you." "You won't be the first to risk yourself for a stranger," she said. It was not pity, it was communion. Two weathered people counting the cost of living. "But the town will point at you and laugh, whether you save me or not." The truth fluttered between them like a moth at a lantern. They both understood how fragile it was to care. It could be broken by a single finger or saved by a single stitch. Ben had lost a family once, in fire and fever and in the trade of men. He had lost his freedom in ways that had nothing to do with iron and chains. He was, if he was anything at all, a man who had learned to keep watch. Yet the auction had unmade his quiet. If they sold Clara, they would sell more than a seamstress. They'd sell permission for the town to trade in women. And Ben had seen what happens to women the town did not talk about. In the months he had moved through shadow and veranda, he had learned whispered things. A ledger with names on it passes hands through town like a bad scent. Railroad men know who goes aboard and who does not come back. He had heard talk at the tavern. "Some women take the train for work," a man would say casually, and Ben would notice how the waiter's hands trembled when he poured. Someone, some people, made a tidy coin selling more than coal in stock. The banker kept ledgers that were carefully separated, as if some lines were sin and others were profit. Clara had found one of those ledgers, tucked in a parcel at the back of a bundle of cloth they had accepted as payment. She had not meant to pry. She kept the ledger folded under her mattress as if it were a damp thing that needed to be dried. The names were not lines on a page. They were people. Some had been taken by trains. Some had been bought in the hush of a back room and never seen again. Clara would lift the cover sometimes and run a thumb across a name, imagining the sound of its owner's laugh and the smell of their hair, and it made her hands want to work faster and quieter. "Please, don't let them take my baby," Elsie had said once, pressing her face to Clara's wool skirt, thinking a doll or the softness of memory could count as family. Clara had promised she would not let anything happen to her. Ben's past made him fierce in a way that sometimes scared Clara. He had lived with a hardness that came from having to hurt to stay alive, but he was learning gentleness again around the kettle and around the tacking needle she used to sew hems at dusk. He learned the names of buttons and how she liked her tea, weak, with a slice of lemon. He learned the small rituals that made her whole, the way she folded a piece of cloth 3 times before putting it on the shelf, the way she hummed the lullaby as she pressed seams, the way she set her needle on the little dish so it would not roll away. There were mornings he found himself lingering by the table, watching her fingers move, amazed that such quiet motions could keep a person upright. When the town began to close in, Ben felt the old compass in his chest swing. It pointed toward a kind of duty he had been running from since he had been called an outlaw. He could not let the ledger remain a secret while the town sold its women like poorly made garments. "If you stay," he told Clara one evening, his breath fogging between them, "you stay as family." "You can't be sure of anyone," she replied, threading a needle with fingers that shook just enough to make the thread dance. The metal bit caught the lamplight. "People surprise you and they disappoint you." "We've both seen it." "I'm sure of you," he said. It was not a big line. It was the sort of small, dangerous truth that can overturn a good life, without either of them meaning to be cruel. He watched the way her cheek flushed when she looked up, and the honest, shy lift of something like relief in his own chest. Days became a ledger too, names on the town's lips. The banker, Amos Verder, kept his collar too tight. The sheriff, with his broad stomach and thin moral compass, kept his eyes near the saloon where promises were made and broken under the table. A woman named Lavinia Price ran the boarding house and the place near the tracks that nobody who mattered would mention. She had been polite to Clara, with the kind of politeness that kept a person's throat clear and their conscience dark. Clara watched them. She watched the way men talked in corners and the way goods moved at night. She kept the ledger tucked beneath flour sacks, then beneath her counter, then under the floorboard where Ben had once slept. "Bankers make a lot of enemies," Elsie said one afternoon, looking at the ledger with a young person's horror in her face. "Should we tell someone?" "Tell who?" Clara answered. "Who will listen to a seamstress about the men who buy mothers for coin?" Her voice shook only a little. She swallowed and tried to steady it. The shop smelled of linen and lavender, and the iron that had been left too long on a seam. Ben had his own list of enemies, men who would like to knock him back into the hole from which he had clawed himself. But when he looked at Clara, when he thought of her needle and her hands and the way she kept the little brass locket near the window, he felt that certain things were not worth counting in coin. Justice was one. Love, if one could call the slow building of tea and mended socks love, was another. They tried to go quietly. Ben had money saved. What a man in hiding tends to keep close. A watch, a horse, a pocket knife. He sold small things, traded them for train tickets, or grain. He and Clara and Elsie made a plan like mending a tear, careful and slow. Leave at dawn, take the ledger to someone who would listen in a town where the law still meant something. Find a judge who did not keep a neat ledger in his own top drawer. When they went into town to collect a trunk, the air was brittle and the rail smoke stung the sinuses. Men spat in the gutters as if to mark their place against the cold. The mayor's daughter looked at Clara like linen crumpled and then smoothed by someone else's hands. "You shouldn't have that ledger out," Lavinia Price said when she saw Clara in the boarding house doorway, her voice as slick as butter and her perfume too sweet for winter. "It's dangerous to poke at men's business." "It's dangerous," Clara agreed, "but we won't be quiet." "You don't understand," Lavinia said, leaning in. "There are things to be left alone. If you poke, you might poke and get poked back." Ben felt the old itch in his palm, the one that had meant a gun historically. He had to practice not letting it be his first answer. He closed his hand until the edges of his nails pressed into his palm and breathed. Instead, he set his jaw and used his voice, the one that had become more measured, like a man who had seen how quickly anger turns to regret. "We're leaving," he said. "We're taking her and the child and that ledger. You can either stand in the way, or you can keep your ledger and your conscience," Lavinia finished. She had the smile of a woman who had made many small kills in her time and hung them tidy in the night. Outside, a freight train made the rails sigh. Men moved like shadows from the warehouse. Clara thought, if she was sold, if they put a price on her head and marched her off in the night, there would be no ledger to speak of and the town would breathe easier for a time. The ledger was a dangerous thing, but sometimes dangerous things are the only things that keep the rest of the world honest. "What if we can't find a judge?" Elsie whispered that night, fear too big for her small sleep. "What if we expose this and the town burns?" Clara answered in the hush between them. "Some debts are paid in coin," she thought. "Others are paid in courage." She fingered the worn stitches on the hem of her own skirt and felt the steady assurance of work beneath her fingertips. The one place they thought might listen was the new preacher, a man who had come with a Bible and a sad look, and who had not yet decided whose side he was on. Ben signed his name in dust on the windowsill like a warning, and then laid out the ledger, folding it open so the lines lay like thin bones under the light. The preacher read. He stiffened. "This is treachery," he said at last, his voice small under the weight of accusation. "Then do something treacherous," Ben answered. "Do what's right." The preacher closed his Bible as if it were a shield. "We'll be quiet," he said. "We'll take to the county. We'll do it lawful." Sometimes lawful is a slow animal that eats the wrong things while it tries to chew. By the time they had collected the trunk and the ledger, and the courage to travel the dusty road to the county seat, the town had been told. A rumor is a thing with too many legs. It moves faster than a man can pray. That night men came. They came like the thaw, gradual, then sudden. The sheriff knocked, then pushed, then used his badge like a cudgel. Lavinia Price called out that they had no business stirring. Two men tried to snatch Elsie from the threshold, their wool sleeves like clumsy hands. Ben threw himself at the intruders because old muscles know old fights. He could have gone in with a gun, but a gun narrows a man to a single violent path. Instead, he used his shoulders, his weight, the advantage of a man who had broken more things than he had built. He took a blow to the arm that would bruise for weeks, but he rounded up the attackers by force and voice, his breath sharp in the cold air. In the chaos, Clara found the ledger under her shawl and the brass locket in her palm. The locket's hinge squeaked when she opened it, and the small face inside looked back with an intimacy only memory gives. She thought of the small gold watch Ben had once taken from a man with no right to it, but had given to the woman on the train who smiled like spring. She thought of the men with coins and no conscience, and felt her own conscience heavy as a skillet. They escaped that night, not because they were clever, but because they were stubborn. They ran like people who had decided a child's future mattered more than propriety. They got to Ben's cabin with the breathlessness of fugitives who had run not for themselves but for the promise that a small girl at their heels would have a tomorrow. The cabin stood against the ridge like a small, stubborn heart. Inside, the stove hummed and smelled of pine and old smoke. A dog who had learned Ben's steps thumped his tail and nosed at bootlaces. The children arranged chairs like a safe harbor. Ben put his hand on Clara's shoulder and the contact was brief, electric. The warmth of his palm threw rough leather a note in a song. He had been skinned by too many winters to make promises lightly, but the promise that kept surfacing was this: if you stay with me. Not as an unpaid woman, but as family. How many more will they try to sell? Clara asked quietly, while she sat mending and the needle flashed silver and then vanished through fabric. Enough to be a shame, Ben said. Enough that we have to be louder than the shame. Then we'll be louder, Clara answered. Her voice was not a shout, it was thread. We'll make a seam of truth they can't unravel. They struck out for the county. The journey was not cinematic in the way the pamphlets always made it. A grand ride across prairie with wind-stiffened scarves. It was cold, hands red, the horse's breath a ghost. They took trains when it seemed safer. They spoke not at all and then too much, sometimes to fill silences, sometimes to stitch hearts. Ben taught Elsie to saddle a horse with a patience that surprised him. He showed her how to cinch the girth and how to feel for the horse's shoulder so the animal would not be startled. Clara taught Ben to catch a needle between calloused fingers and to feel the small triumphant satisfaction when a mistake is fixed, guiding his hand once when his thumb trembled and laughing softly, the sound like bell iron. At the county, the man in charge, Judge Harridan, took the ledger and made a face like someone who had swallowed something sour. He read first line and last, then the names of women who were gone. His assistant was a man who'd once owed a saloon debt to Lavinia Price and had never been paid. In that canyon of favors and shame, they had to make a choice. Judge Harridan could either look away and keep his quiet town, or he could act. Ben watched the judge's hands. He had his own hands, scarred and steady. He would have preferred to take the judge's hand in his own and wrench open the ledger like a door, but Ben knew lawmen aren't like men with weapons. They wore their power in a different skin. "You'll need witnesses," the judge said at last, the words mechanical and weary. "You have witnesses," Clara said, because it hurt that anyone should ask for more proof when the ledger was proof enough. She thought of the women who had been bought with coin and led to trains that never returned. She thought of their faces, of the dress hems she had mended that had smelled of two different kinds of fear. They marshaled witnesses like a slow parade. Some women who had been sold before found courage at last. A laundress cleared her throat and told of the night Lavinia Price had led a train car away. A young woman cried and said she had once been a boarder and then sold. She had come back with a voice cracked by whiskey and sorrow. Each witness nudged the town's conscience like a needle cutting through a tough seam. Ben stayed quiet. His presence was a thing that moved the room without him moving. When asked to testify, he said only that he had seen transactions and that he had hidden people taken. He didn't paint himself as hero or villain. Sometimes you don't need to put every sin into a sentence for it to count. The ledger turned the old boys club into witnesses. The county bailiff had trouble holding backs that had been sold so readily. The judge set an order. Arrest warrants were written. The names, the banker, the sheriff, Lavinia Price, were on a list like a slow-feathered storm coming. When the town heard, it trembled in two. Some trembled in fear, others in relief. Houses split like old trees. There were men who had invested in the trade and feared the ledger's open page, and there were women who had been bought and who now, for the first time, saw the possibility of being names in a book that had no columns for coin. "You're brave," Ben told Clara one night after they had given testimony and walked as if through a fog. "You could have been sold. You could have been gone. You bore up and still stood." Clara put her hand on his arm, feeling the callous and warmth there, the steadying weight of him. "I've been alone for a long time. You aren't alone earlier than you should be, Ben Mallory. But we were both kept together by stubbornness." "She's been alone too," Elsie said, sitting up close, her small hand slipping into Clara's, the child needing a proof as much as a promise. "I don't like to think they can buy my life. Neither do I," Ben said. He felt old and new at the same time, like a man who had buried his sins and now had to stand in daylight and own whatever he had done. "If the town turns its back on you, I won't." The public hearing was worse than the private shame. Lavinia Price arrived in her self-appointed finery, her face a mask of civility. The banker, Amos Verter, wore his best vest and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The sheriff wore his badge bright as a coin. The town crowded the wooden benches and pressed faces to the windows. The scent of boiled coffee and hot metal, and something like fear, sat on every breath. "You ain't nothing but a seamstress," Amos said through his teeth when it was his turn to be agonized. "You sew for a living." "What would you know of ledgers and trains?" "I know more than I wanted to," Clara answered. Her voice was steady, the needlework of memory in it. "I know you can write a name and it can disappear. I know you can make a ledger and call it business." A dozen small things happened at once. The preacher cleared his throat and looked toward the bench. The judge's face went colder than a whip, and Ben felt the shift in the room like the rearranging of furniture. The judge read the names, will, and wait behind his words. Warrants were signed, horses were saddled, but men like Amos and the sheriff have friends, and friends are often quick to make trouble for those who pry. That night, Lavinia Price sent men to the cabin. She sent them to take back what she thought was rightfully hers, and to teach Clara that poking at a ledger is like poking a wasp's nest. Ben had been warned in the county, but even warnings do not always stop bodies from being sent in a dark hour. They came with ropes and a hunger to set things back how they had always been. They came slung with the arrogance of men who think themselves entitled. One of them, Tom Haynes, a local who had once been paid a small debt in favors, lunged for Elsie with a hand like a spider. Ben threw himself across the man because a long habit had taught him to act first and explain later. Blows were given. A shot rang out in the yard, a sound that spat like a bad omen. No one described it afterwards with the detail of a newspaper. Clara just knew that Ben took a blow that would bruise him for a month and that he made sure Elsie was safe. He gave the men time enough to think. "I'll not give up a child for coin," he said, and his voice was iron wrapped in a song. They fought like people who have nothing left to lose except each other. Ben's hands found an old fighting rhythm. He put his back to the door and made the men run against him like the sea. But in that pushing and pulling, someone reached for the ledger. In the scuffle, Clara saw a man trying to burn the ledger with a poker meant for the stove. She moved like a seam she did not have to think about, snatching the poker and flipping it aside. "You could die for this," Ben snapped, grabbing at her shoulder, his voice a brittle edge. "You could get yourself, and you could lose the chance to make it right if you do nothing," she answered, and for once neither of them had the right to say the other was wrong. Each had chosen a dangerous thing. They had chosen family. Ben knocked the poker away, and with a motion that was both cruel and merciful, threw himself between the man with the poker and Clara. The poker hissed and the ledger survived, warped but legible. The men fled into the night, muzzled by fear and the knowledge that the county would not be deaf forever. There was a silence after the storm, the kind that feels like cities rebuilding themselves. Ben sat on the floor with his coat undone and his hands worrying at a torn seam. Clara found his wound, a shallow bruise that would bloom a deep purple like a skirt in winter. She pressed a cloth to it, her hands gentle and sure, the fabric cool against the bump. He watched her, how her thumbs smoothed the cloth, the careful motion of someone who had made a life of mending, and something in him softened. "You could have died," Elsie said, voice small as an animal. "Trying to save you was the least I could do," Ben said, and his hand lifted to where Clara's cloth rested on his arm, fingers hovering for a moment as if to memorize the weight of her touch. "You saved more than me," Clara said, fingers still on his arm. She looked at him, at the set of his jaw, at the man who had once been a wanted poster and was now a promise. Her voice broke on the last word and she laughed once, short and a little afraid. "Don't say that," he said. "You sound like you're leaving me a loaf I can't earn." "It's not a loaf," she said. "It's something else." She brushed the stray snow from his collar and felt the warmth of him through the wet wool. They spoke in the hush between the stoves and the rain-slowing light. Ben's hands were careful with a tenderness he had not used in a long time. Clara's fingers moved in the small ways seamstresses have, mending and smoothing. They were domestic in a way neither had been for quite some time, and the ordinary intimacy of their touches had a power not loud but steady. He learned to wash a pan without gripping the handle like a handhold for battle. She taught him how much water to leave in a pot so the bread would rise better. "What are we doing?" Elsie asked, sleep rough and needing a hand, her small head on Clara's knee. "We're staying," Clara answered. "We're staying together." She felt the truth in the words root like thread through cloth. "And if the town doesn't want you?" Ben said softly. There was fear folded into that simple question. The outlaw in him had learned to expect reprisal. Loyalty to a fallen comrade is expensive. "Then we'll make our own town," Clara said. It was not a boast. It was a decision, spoken with the quiet steadiness of someone who had learned how to keep a roof over a small head and to count on a neighbor's kindness. They took the evidence to the press, the kind of man who sets ink in his hands and will print the truth even if it burns his light. The story was printed in a headline made of black, honest type. Ledger exposes trafficking ring. The town woke to it like one who has had a fog cleared from their window. Not everyone read it and changed. Men and women had their own investments, but enough read it. Amos Verder's smile turned to sour. The sheriff's broad back curved with weight. Lavinia Price found herself without the men who thought the trade would line their pockets forever. The county arrested those it could without reaching too far into the very men who made the market run. It was imperfect justice, but it was breath in lungs, a clearing. The Ledger's lines had been put where they could not be ignored. In the aftermath, the town divided. Some stared at Clara and Elsie as if they were newly minted trouble. Others, the small kindnesses who had always been there between the more famous cruelties, gave them a pie or a sack of flour or a look that said quietly, "You did the right thing." Ben stood with them in the townspeople's gaze and felt the old coat of outlaw on his shoulders. But he had done a thing that had nothing to do with past crimes. He had kept a promise. He had chosen a kind of redemption that could not be bought or lawfully granted. He had risked, and in that risk, found the simple dignity of the man he wanted to be. After the arrests, there were quiet days. Clara sewed dresses that were not a cover for sorrow, but small celebrations. A school teacher's new dress, a chubby child's jacket, a simple frock for a woman who had been forced to wear only drab for too long. She kept the ledger in a drawer now, closed, because it had done its work. Ben worked the fields a little and fixed fences and learned to bake bread that rose slow but true. On dusty afternoons, Clara would show him how to fold the dough and press the seams of a pie crust, laughing when his fingers left prints in the flour. He and Clara shared meals that were both the same and miraculous, because there was a hand that put a pie on the table and someone to say, "Take more." Some men in town would not forgive. There were always those. Amos Verder kept his disdain and his small fortunes, but there were others who woke with a new conscience. They mended fences and mended ways. The preacher preached with a steadier voice. The judge did what he could. One evening, Ben and Clara sat on the porch and watched Elsie and other children play in the yard, their cheeks bright as apples, their boots pounding a rhythm into the grass. The sun slid like butter behind the hills, warm on their faces. Ben reached for Clara's hand as if by right rather than by habit, and she let him take it, feeling the roughness of his palm against the softness of hers. "I'm not asking for apologies," he said. He had the watch in his hand, the old silver watch he had once been given by a man who'd asked only that Ben be kinder for a moment. He slipped it into Clara's palm instead, the metal warm from his body, the weight of it familiar as a heartbeat. "What is it?" she asked. "Another thing to sell?" She tried to squeeze humor into her voice because humor could be a needle light enough to fix an aching seam. He laughed, the sound low and something like relief. "It's nothing to sell. It's the thing I don't need to hold on to anymore." Clara looked at the watch, at the way light slid across its face, at the old engraving on its back. Time mended. She thought of all the ways time had been cruel and kind. She thought of promises kept and unkept, and of the ledger that had changed the town. Her thumb brushed the tiny letters, and she felt the steady warmth of Ben's hand at her back. "We don't have to say anything to make this right," she said. "We can keep our mournings and our stitches. We can keep the simple, terrible truth of being together. Will you marry me, Clara?" Ben asked, and the question was like the hush before rain. He said it not with a flourish, but with the real quiet of a man asking for a hand to hold through the next storms. "Will you be my family? If you stay as mine." Clara felt everything in that question. Fear, danger, longing, safety. Her pulse kicked in the hollow of her throat. She saw the years ahead as small tasks, mending shirts, making bread, waking to a hand that would pull their shared blanket up on lonely nights. Marriage was a promise and a gamble and a stitch that would bind two ragged hems. She had seen too many women lose their names in the language of men who bought and sold them. Ben offered a name that did not take, but offered. "Yes," she said, because the word was both a promise and a work. "Yes, Ben Mallory, if you'll have me." Her voice trembled on the last syllable, and she smiled because the trembling was not only fear, but the simplest sort of hope. "I'll have you," he said, like a man who had been given a second language and meant to speak it carefully. "I'll have you and Elsie, and whatever storms come after." They were not dramatic people. Their vows were quiet, spoken before friends who had not forgotten the ledger, before a preacher who had learned what a sermon required, on a porch with chairs from mismatched homes. The knot they tied was simple. They shared a bread, and the first slow, awkward dance their home would remember. Ben's arm was a little unsure, and then steady like a weathered post. Children laughed. The town watched, some with approval, some with folded arms. The weeks that followed were lit by small domestic miracles. Clara opened her shop again with a sign that read, "Heart Seams," and people came, not because scandal sells, but because good work and a friendly face had a way of returning business. Elsie went to school and learned to write her name in a hand that never would be sold for coin. Ben planted a small garden by the fence, beans and a stubborn row of carrots, and mended not just fences but trust. He learned to trim hedges and to carry water without flinching at the weight. There were visits to the graves of those they had lost. Ben went to a small stone under an oak, hands on his hat, and spoke to the daughter he had once had, his voice small and honest. Clara folded a ribbon and laid it there as if she could stitch peace into the earth. They both went because the past must have its due, or else it will come to take the present without warning. The town began in small ways to be kinder. The preacher opened soup on Sundays that both fed and healed. The laundress kept a basin near the river for those who had been in need without question. Small people did small things, and small things add up like stitches until a garment is made whole again. Ben and Clara kept their own patchwork of habits. In the evenings, they would sit by the stove, Clara sewing, Ben whittling or reading the newspaper aloud in a voice that had grown less guarded and more steady. He pronounced words carefully, learned to finish her sentences, and she learned the spaces in his that needed filling. They shared a cup of tea after supper, the lemon fixed in a small saucer, their hands finding one another across a table like two loose threads that have found each other and will not come apart. Sometimes, on a winter night when the snow began to fall again, Clara would look at Ben and remember the auction, the smell of coal and the cold breath of men, and think of how thin the thread had been between being someone's property and being someone's family. She would watch the small rise and fall of his chest as he slept, and feel the odd, profound rightness of having someone else's breath in the same room. "What would you have done?" Elsie asked one night, leaning against Clara and peeking at the map on the wall. "If no one had come?" "We would have found a way," Clara said. She thought of the ledger and the way truth had cut. "We would have been stubborn. We would have been loud. We'd have made a place for ourselves." She looked at Ben, who was mending a threadbare glove with the same care he used to tie a knot in rope, and felt gratitude like a small warming coal. "Did you ever think you'd marry?" Ben asked one evening, just the two of them. The room mellow with light, the bread cooling on the shelf. Clara's hands moved over a dress hem. "I'd been too busy mending to think about being mended." He smiled, the lines softening the hard planes of his face. "Then let me be the mending." "You already have been," she said softly, the words like a stitch that holds flesh from cold. He reached and caught her fingers. Neither moved for a long, easy moment. Weeks turned into months. The ledger had been read aloud in courtrooms and in the printed page. Some men were sent away. Others lost what made their lives easy. The town's ledger of shame had been opened, and the town had to decide whether it wanted to be better. It chose, in the end, to mend. One spring day, warm and sharp as new cloth, Clara stood at the river with a packet in her hands. She had sewn a dress for a small woman who had been given another chance. She thought of the ledger and of all the men and women who had been bought and sold as if they were the same thing as a bolt of cloth. The river said yes as it ran past, indifferent and faithful. Ben stood behind her and slid his hand into hers. The years they had stolen from worry and from danger had been returned like a small inheritance. They had not been rich in coin, but they had a table that rarely sat empty, and a house whose roof did not leak, and most rare of all, a town that had been forced to look at itself and then choose. For the first time in years, tomorrow didn't sound like a threat, Clara said aloud, almost to be sure. Ben tightened his grip. No, it sounds like a promise. They walked back home with the sun at their backs, a path of gold through the grass. Children ran ahead calling names, and the dog that had learned to wait for them wagged like a metronome of the simple life. The house smelled of bread rising and of lavender, of cloth and of warm iron. Inside, Elsie sat drawing with a pencil and the small smudge of future, and the locket Clara kept at the window caught the light and flashed like a small point of victory. There would always be winters that could break you. There would always be men who thought they could make a coin of a human life, but there would also be people who would stand in a square on a winter night and refuse to let a woman be sold. There would be those who would hide the outlaw in an attic, and later watch him stand in court and call down a truth. There would be small things, a mended hem, a child's laugh, a loaf of bread, a watch in a palm. Some debts are paid in dollars, others in courage. For the first time in years, tomorrow didn't sound like a threat.